In Millbrook, a disabled veteran was about to discover the true cost of trust when his car broke down outside a predatory auto shop. David Patterson wasn't your typical retiree. For 22 years, he had served in the Air Force, known for his integrity and independence. When he encountered Tony Castellano demanding $8,000 for fraudulent repairs, he had no idea he was walking into a scam that would trigger an extraordinary military response. What began as one veteran's crisis would become a covert mission of justice that proved some bonds of service never break. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The rain drummed against the Honda Civic's windshield like artillery fire in the distance, each drop a reminder of storms Dave Patterson had weathered in places far from home. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white against the worn leather, a nervous habit that had developed somewhere between his third deployment and Carol's diagnosis. The wipers squeaked their protest across the glass, leaving streaks that blurred the road ahead into watercolor smears of grey asphalt and yellow lines. Highway 9 stretched before him like a ribbon of uncertainty, flanked by the kind of small-town America that had once felt like sanctuary, but now seemed to press in from all sides. Dave checked the dashboard clock, 8:47 a.m. He'd be cutting it close for his 9:30 appointment at the VA hospital, but Dr. Morrison had been understanding about his struggles with punctuality since Carol's passing. Time had become elastic. For Dave, minutes stretching into hours during the lonely nights, while entire days collapsed into nothing when the weight of grief pressed down too heavily. The engine's cough caught him off guard, a wet, rattling sound that spoke of something fundamental going wrong. Dave's foot eased off the accelerator instinctively, the way he'd learned to recognize the first signs of trouble in the machinery that had kept him alive through 22 years of service. But this wasn't a Humvee that could be coaxed another. Mile on prayers and stubbornness, this was Carol's car, the last gift she'd given him before the cancer took her voice, then her strength, then everything else. "Come on, girl," he whispered, the same tone he'd used to comfort her during those final weeks. "Just a few more miles." The Honda responded with a shudder that ran through the frame like a death rattle. Steam began rising from under the hood, wisps at first, then billowing clouds that obscured his vision. The temperature gauge needle swung into the red zone with the finality of a judge's gavel. Dave pulled onto the shoulder, gravel crunching under the tires, as the engine gave one last labored breath before falling silent. He sat in the sudden quiet, listening to the rain and the tick of cooling metal. The silence felt familiar. Not peaceful, but heavy with the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. In Afghanistan, he'd learned that machinery could fail at the worst possible moments, that preparation meant nothing when luck ran out. But this felt different. This felt impersonal. Dave pulled out his phone. The screen cracked from a drop he couldn't quite remember and scrolled through his contacts. AA had been Carol's idea. "Just in case," she'd said with that smile that could convince him of anything. His thumb hovered over the number, pride warring with necessity. 22 years of military service had taught him self-reliance above all else, but sitting on the side of Highway 9 in a dead car while rain turned the world grey, that lesson felt more like a burden than a strength. The tow truck arrived 40 minutes later, its yellow lights cutting through the gloom like a beacon of reluctant salvation. The driver was a heavy-set man with kind eyes who didn't ask unnecessary questions, the sort of professional courtesy Dave appreciated. They loaded the Honda onto the flatbed with the efficiency of a well-practiced ritual, and Dave climbed into the cab beside him. "Nearest shop's Castellano's Auto Repair," the driver said, adjusting his mirrors. "Tony runs an honest business. He'll take care of you." Dave nodded, watching his car in the side mirror as they pulled back onto the highway. The Honda looked smaller somehow, diminished by its mechanical failure and the indignity of being carried, rather than driving under its own power. He remembered the day Carol had surprised him with it, a modest celebration of his medical retirement that neither of them had wanted to acknowledge as anything more than a transition. "You need something reliable," she'd said, pressing the keys into his palm. "Something that'll get you where you need to go when I can't." Even then, she'd known. The cancer had been in remission, but Carol had possessed an intuition about endings that had both comforted and terrified him. She'd chosen the Honda because it was practical, dependable, qualities she'd valued in machinery and men alike. Castellano's Auto Repair occupied a corner lot where two residential streets met Highway 9, its brick facade weathered but solid. Hand-painted signs advertised fair prices and quality work, the kind of modest promises that Dave's generation had been raised to trust. As the tow truck maneuvered the Honda into the service bay, Dave caught sight of the proprietor emerging from the office, a man in his 50s with silver-threaded hair and the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. "Tony Castellano," the man said, extending a hand that engulfed Dave's in a grip just firm enough to suggest reliability without crossing into intimidation. "Sorry to see you having car trouble on a day like this." Dave sized him up automatically, a habit ingrained by years of evaluating potential threats and allies in foreign territories. Tony's clothes were clean but lived in. His hands showed honest calluses, and his eyes carried the practiced sympathy of someone who'd delivered bad news to countless car owners. Nothing in his demeanor suggested deception, yet something in Dave's gut, the same instinct that had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments, whispered a warning he couldn't quite articulate. "Dave Patterson," he replied, accepting the handshake. "Appreciate you taking a look. She just gave up on me." Tony's eyes swept over Dave with the efficiency of a mechanic diagnosing an engine, taking in the military bearing that 22 years of service had carved into his posture, the modest clothing that spoke of careful budgeting, the slight favor of his left leg that suggested old injuries. Dave recognized the assessment for what it was, though he misinterpreted its purpose. He'd assumed Tony was simply gauging his mechanical knowledge, not calculating his vulnerability. "Let's see what we're dealing with," Tony said, leading him toward the Honda. The diagnostic took 20 minutes, during which Dave stood in the service bay, watching Tony probe the engine with the focused attention of a surgeon. The rain continued its steady assault on the metal roof, creating a white noise backdrop that made the space feel isolated from the world outside. Dave found himself thinking of Carol's hands, the way she'd touched his face during those final days when words had become too difficult. Everything led back to her. Every decision, every moment of doubt, every small crisis that reminded him how alone he'd become. "Well," Tony said, straightening from under the hood and wiping his hands on a rag, "I've got good news and bad news." Dave braced himself, recognizing the preamble to unwelcome information. "Let's hear it." "Good news is, she's not completely dead. Bad news is, you're looking at a complete engine rebuild. Timing chain went, took out the valves, probably damaged the pistons. It's not a small job." The words hit Dave like incoming mortar fire, anticipated but still devastating in their impact. "What kind of money are we talking about?" Tony's expression shifted into the practiced solemnity of a funeral director delivering final arrangements. "Parts and labor. I'd say around 8,000, maybe a little less if we get lucky with the internals." $8,000. The number hung in the air between them like smoke from an explosion, impossible to ignore and devastating in its implications. Dave's disability check barely covered his rent and basic expenses, and his savings, what little Carol's medical bills had left, wouldn't stretch to cover a fraction of such a cost. 8,000. he repeated, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. "I know it's a lot," Tony said, his voice carrying just the right note of understanding. "But look at it this way. You could spend 3 times that much on a replacement vehicle and you'd never know what you're getting. This Honda's got good bones. With a rebuilt engine, she'll run another 100,000 miles easy." Dave stared at the car. Carol's final gift to him, reduced to a collection of failing parts and mounting expenses. He could see her in his memory, keys dangling from her finger as she smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd solved a problem before it became critical. She'd wanted him to have independence, mobility, the freedom to choose his own destinations rather than depending on others for transportation. "I don't have that kind of money readily available," Dave admitted, the confession feeling like a betrayal of everything his military training had taught him about self-sufficiency. "No problem," Tony said smoothly. "We can work out a payment plan. I've been doing this long enough to know that good people sometimes hit rough patches. You've got an honest face, Mr. Patterson. I can tell you're the kind of man who honors his commitments." The flattery felt genuine enough, delivered with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to putting people at ease. Dave wanted to believe. It needed to believe it, because the alternative was admitting that Carol's final gift had become a burden he couldn't bear. "What would I need to put down?" he asked. "Let's say 2,000 to get started, balance payable over 12 months. Keeps your monthly payment reasonable." Dave calculated quickly. 2,000 would drain most of his savings, but it was possible. Barely possible. The monthly payments would be tight, requiring careful budgeting and perhaps some sacrifices, but Carol had always been good with money. She'd taught him to plan for contingencies, to think beyond the immediate crisis. "All right," he said, the words emerging before his rational mind could raise further objections. "Let's do it." Tony's smile broadened with what appeared to be genuine relief. "Excellent. Let me get the paperwork started. We'll have her running like new in no time." Morrison had taught him. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4. The rhythm helped, but slowly, like medication that took time to reach his bloodstream. By the time his heartbeat had returned to normal, the soup had grown cold, and the rain had softened to a whisper against the windows. That night, Dave dreamed of Carol in the hospital bed, her hands pale against the white sheets as she pressed the Honda's keys into his palm. In the dream, she was trying to tell him something important, but the words wouldn't come. He could see her lips moving, could feel the urgency in her touch, but the meaning remained just beyond his understanding. He woke at 3 a.m. with the taste of regret in his mouth and the conviction that he'd made a terrible mistake. But the work order was signed, the down payment committed, and Tony Castellano's business card sat on his nightstand like evidence of a decision that couldn't be undone. Dave lay in the darkness, listening to the silence that had become his constant companion, and tried to remember Carol's voice, telling him it was okay to accept help when it was offered. But all he could hear was his father's warnings about trusting strangers with your future, and the echo of his own voice, agreeing to payments he couldn't afford for repairs he couldn't verify. The rain had stopped, but the damage was already done. Somewhere across town, his car sat in Tony Castellano's shop like a hostage to circumstances beyond his control, and Dave Patterson faced another sleepless night, calculating the cost of trust. In a world that seemed designed to exploit it, morning would bring new challenges, but for now there was only the weight of pride pressing down like atmospheric pressure before a storm, and the growing certainty that he'd stepped into something he didn't understand and couldn't escape. Morning arrived with the pale light of a sun struggling through yesterday's storm clouds, casting Millbrook in shades of grey that matched Dave Patterson's mood. He'd managed perhaps 3 hours of fitful sleep, haunted by dreams where Carol's voice carried warnings he couldn't quite decipher. The coffee maker gurgled to life with the reliability that had become precious in a world where everything else seemed prone to failure. Dave checked his phone. 2 missed calls from Tony Castellano, both after midnight. The timestamps made his stomach clench. No honest mechanic called customers at that hour unless something had gone catastrophically wrong. He listened to the voicemails while sipping coffee that tasted like regret. "Mr. Patterson, Tony here. Just wanted to update you on the car. Found some additional issues when we got deeper into the engine. Nothing we can't handle, but I wanted to give you a heads up. Call me back when you get this." The second message came 90 minutes later, Tony's voice carrying a note of concern that felt practiced. "Dave, sorry to bother you again, but we really need to discuss these complications. Before I go any further, don't want to surprise you with anything. Give me a call first thing in the morning." Dave deleted both messages without returning the calls. Whatever complications Tony had discovered could wait until after his VA appointment, an appointment he'd already rescheduled twice and couldn't afford to miss again. Dr. Morrison had been patient about his irregular attendance, but even military therapists had limits to their understanding. The Uber ride to the VA hospital cost $22, a price that stung more than it should have. Dave watched Millbrook slide past the window, modest houses giving way to strip malls, then the institutional architecture that surrounded the medical complex. The driver, a college student working between classes, made polite conversation about the weather and the local college football team. Dave responded with the minimal courtesy that kept social interactions from becoming personal, a skill he'd perfected since Carol's death. The VA hospital waiting room carried the familiar weight of institutional patients. Vinyl chairs arranged in precise rows, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look vaguely ill, and the particular silence of people who'd learned that complaining wouldn't accelerate their appointment times. Dave checked in with the receptionist, a middle-aged woman whose professional sympathy had been worn smooth by years of managing veterans' schedules and crises. "Dr. Morrison is running about 20 minutes behind," she said, her voice carrying the practiced apologetics of government efficiency. "You can have a seat anywhere you'd like." Dave chose a chair near the window where he could watch the parking lot and avoid eye contact with other patients. The waiting room held the usual collection of veterans from various eras: Vietnam, survivors who moved with the careful deliberation of men carrying invisible injuries, Iraq and Afghanistan veterans whose youth was tempered by eyes that had seen too much, and the occasional Gulf War veteran like himself, caught between generations of conflict. "Excuse me, Staff Sergeant Patterson?" Dave looked up to find a young black airman in dress blues standing beside his chair, the kind of military bearing that suggested recent promotion and the pride that came with earning it. The name tape read Johnson, and his sleeve carried the 3 stripes of a staff sergeant. Something in his posture triggered Dave's automatic assessment. Good soldier, probably technical specialty, the sort of airman who'd make master sergeant if he stayed in long enough. "It's just Dave now," he replied, noting how the young man's use of his former rank felt both natural and strange. "I've been retired for a while." "Staff Sergeant Marcus Johnson," the airman said, extending his hand. "Mac, I heard you talking to the receptionist about Dr. Morrison. He's my buddy Tommy's counselor, too. Tommy's in room 3 right now." Dave accepted the handshake, recognizing the peculiar camaraderie that existed among veterans seeking mental health treatment. There was no shame in the acknowledgement. They were all here for similar reasons, carrying burdens that civilian therapists often couldn't fully understand. "You stationed at Edwards?" Dave asked, noting the base patch on Mac's uniform. "Yes, sir. Aircraft maintenance, working on the new trainer program." Mac glanced around the waiting room, then back to Dave. "Mind if I ask, you having car trouble? I couldn't help but overhear you on the phone with someone about repair costs." Dave's guard went up instinctively. 2 years of isolation had taught him to be wary of strangers who showed too much interest in his personal circumstances. But something in Mac's manner, the genuine concern that reminded him of the young airman he'd mentored during his final years of service, made him reconsider his automatic defensiveness. "Honda gave up on me yesterday," Dave admitted. "Timing. Chain, apparently, looking at some serious repair costs." Mac's expression shifted, the casual interest replaced by the focused attention Dave recognized from his own days working on military vehicles. "Timing chain on a Honda? What year and model?" 2018 Civic. Only got about 60,000 miles on it." "Sir," Mac said, his voice carrying a note of concern that made Dave's stomach tighten, "I've worked on a lot of Hondas. Timing chains don't usually fail on those engines until well past 100,000 miles, and even then, they give you plenty of warning." "What exactly did the mechanic tell you was wrong?" Dave found himself recounting his experience at Castellano's auto repair, watching Mac's expression grow increasingly troubled as he described Tony's diagnosis and the $8,000 estimate. When he finished, Mac was quiet for a long moment, the kind of silence that preceded bad news. "Mr. Patterson," Mac said carefully, "I think you might want to get a second opinion. That repair estimate doesn't sound right. Not for a 2018 Honda, with that mileage." The words hit Dave like incoming fire, anticipated but devastating in their implications. He'd signed paperwork, committed to payments, trusted Tony's assessment, because he'd needed to believe in someone's expertise. The possibility that he'd been deceived felt worse than simple mechanical failure. "Are you saying he's lying?" Dave asked. Mac glanced around the waiting room, then leaned closer. "I'm saying that diagnosis doesn't match what I know about those engines. And $8,000 for a timing chain replacement. Sir, that's robbery, even if everything he's claiming is true." Dave pulled out his phone and showed Mac the photos he'd taken of Tony's written estimate. Mac studied the screen with the intensity he'd probably brought to aircraft maintenance manuals, his expression growing darker with each line item. "This is bullshit," Mac said quietly, forgetting military protocol in his indignation. "Half of these parts don't even need replacement for a timing chain job, and these labor hours, he's billing you for a complete engine rebuild when you probably need a couple $100 worth of actual repairs." The waiting room seemed to shrink around Dave as the implications settled into his consciousness. He'd been deceived, not by mechanical failure, but by human predation. The realization felt personal in a way that simple misfortune couldn't touch. "What should I do?" he asked, the question emerging before pride could stop it. Mac was quiet. For a moment, studying Dave with the assessment skills that military service had taught them both. When he spoke, his voice carried the determination Dave remembered from his own younger days in uniform. "Let me make some calls," Mac said. "I know people who can help. Good people, military people who understand what it means to take care of each other." Dave wanted to refuse, to maintain the independence that had carried him through 2 decades of service and 2 years of widowhood. But sitting in the VA waiting room with Carol's car, held hostage by a predatory mechanic, surrounded by other veterans carrying their own burdens, he found himself nodding agreement. "I'd appreciate that," he said, the words feeling like a small surrender. Mac pulled out his own phone and snapped photos of the repair estimate. "Give me your contact information. I'm going to look into this and get back to you. And, sir, don't authorize any additional work until we figure out what's really going on." As Mac headed back to check on his friend, Dave sat in the vinyl chair, feeling something he hadn't experienced since Carol's death, the possibility that he wasn't as alone as he'd believed. The weight of pride that had pressed down on him for months felt lighter somehow, shared with someone who understood both the burden and the necessity of asking for help. When Dr. Morrison called his name 20 minutes later, Dave walked toward The counseling office carrying not just his own troubles, but the unexpected gift of connection with someone who'd reminded him that military brotherhood didn't end with retirement papers. Outside, the sun finally broke through the storm clouds, casting Millbrook in shades of possibility that Dave hadn't allowed himself to see in far too long. Mac Johnson walked through the main gate of Edwards Air Force Base with Dave Patterson's situation weighing on his mind like unfinished maintenance that couldn't wait until the next shift. The photos of Tony Castellano's repair estimate burned in his phone's memory, each inflated line item a personal insult to everything Mac had learned about honest work and fair dealing. His dress blues drew the usual salutes from the gate guards, but his thoughts were already racing ahead to the conversation he needed to have with Master Sergeant Rachel Torres. The base buzzed with its usual afternoon activity, airmen moving between buildings with the purposeful efficiency that marked military life, the distant roar of aircraft engines from the flight line, and the particular energy that came from people who understood their individual efforts contributed to something larger than themselves. Mac had always drawn strength from that collective purpose, but today it felt especially relevant. He found Rachel in Bay 7 of the main maintenance hangar, her sleeves rolled up and her hands buried in the engine compartment of a T-6A Texan trainer. Her team worked around her with the synchronized efficiency of people who'd learned to trust each other's competence completely. When she looked up at Mac's approach, her expression shifted from focused concentration to the alert attention that meant she recognized something important was coming. "Staff Sergeant Johnson," she said, straightening and wiping her hands on a shop rag. "You look like a man with something on his mind." "Master Sergeant Torres, I need to talk to you about something off the books. It's about a veteran who's getting screwed over by a civilian mechanic." Rachel's expression hardened instantly. At 38, she'd served long enough to develop strong opinions about people who preyed on those who'd served their country. Her own single parenthood had taught her about financial vulnerability, and her combat experience in Afghanistan had reinforced her belief that military family took care of its own. "What kind of situation?" she asked. Mac pulled out his phone and showed her the photos of Dave's repair estimate. "Remember Staff Sergeant Dave Patterson? Served with us in Afghanistan, got medically retired about 2 years ago." Rachel's face went through a series of changes as recognition dawned. Patterson, quiet guy, always volunteered for the shit details, never complained about anything. Lost his wife to cancer, right? That's him. He's getting taken for $8,000 by some scumbag mechanic in town. Timing chain supposedly went on a 2018 Honda with 60,000 miles. The whole diagnosis is garbage. Rachel studied the phone screen with the intensity she brought to aircraft maintenance manuals, her jaw tightening with each line item. Mac could see the anger building behind her eyes. Not the hot flash of immediate irritation, but the cold, calculating fury that came from recognizing injustice and having the power to do something about it. $8,000, she said quietly, for work that shouldn't cost more than $500 if it even needs to be done. "Sir, Patterson's living on disability. This is going to destroy him financially." Rachel handed the phone back to Mac, her decision already made. "Who else knows about this?" "Just me so far. I told him I'd make some calls." "Good. Let's keep the circle small until we know what we're dealing with." Rachel looked around the hangar, her gaze settling on 2 airmen working at separate stations. "Chen, Williams, drop what you're doing and get over here." Senior Airman Lisa Chen approached first, her small frame moving with the efficient grace that had made her one of the best logistics specialists on base. Behind her came Technical Sergeant Jake Williams. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A quiet Texan whose reputation with engines was legendary among the maintenance crews. Both carried the alert attention that came from being summoned by a senior NCO who meant business. "We've got a situation," Rachel began, her voice carrying. "The authority that had kept aircraft flying through 2 combat deployments. One of our own is getting robbed by a civilian mechanic, and we're going to fix it." She outlined Dave's situation with the clinical precision she brought to briefings, watching her team's faces as the details sank in. Lisa's expression shifted from concern to organized determination, the look she got when presented with a logistics challenge that required creative solutions. Jake's face went through a different transformation, his usual quiet demeanor replaced by the focused intensity he showed when diagnosing mechanical problems. "Patterson," Jake said when Rachel finished. "Good soldier, helped me out of a jam in Kandahar when my convoy got hit. Never forgot that." "What's the plan, Master Sergeant?" Lisa asked, already reaching for the small notebook she used to organize. "Complex operations." Rachel looked around the hangar, ensuring their conversation remained private. "First, we need intelligence. Lisa, I want you to research this Castellano character. Find out everything you can about his business practices, complaints, whatever's out there. Jake, I need you to look at those repair photos and tell me exactly what's wrong with that diagnosis." Jake was already studying Mac's phone screen again, his trained eye cataloging the estimate with professional disgust. This is amateur hour. Half these parts don't even connect to the timing chain assembly. And these labor hours he's charging for work that doesn't exist. "How long would a legitimate timing chain replacement take on that engine?" Rachel asked, "if it actually needed one. 4 hours, maybe 5. But sir, I'd bet money that timing chain is fine. These symptoms sound more like a water pump or thermostat issue. $100 part, 2 hours labor max." Lisa looked up from her notebook. "Master Sergeant, what are we talking about in terms of resources? Because if we're going to help Staff Sergeant Patterson, we need to think about how this looks from a command perspective." Rachel appreciated Lisa's attention to the bigger picture. "Good point. This stays between us for now. We help a fellow veteran with car trouble, using our own time and skills. Nothing that compromises our military duties or involves government resources." "What about legal issues?" Mac asked. "If this mechanic is running a scam operation, do we gather evidence first, then decide how to proceed? If Castellano's defrauding veterans, that's a matter for the authorities. But our primary mission is taking care of Patterson." Jake pulled out his own phone and began scrolling through his contacts. "I know a parts supplier who'll give us wholesale prices, and there's an independent shop across town, Frank's Place. Heard he's good people, former military. Might be worth talking to him." "Do it," Rachel said, "but carefully. We don't know who else might be involved in this." Lisa had been taking notes throughout the conversation, her organizational mind already structuring their response. Timeline? Because if Staff Sergeant Patterson is supposed to start making payments on this fraudulent repair. As Dave followed Tony into the office to sign the work order, he carried with him the weight of a decision that felt both necessary and wrong. Carol's voice echoed in his memory. Not words of caution, but encouragement to accept help when it was offered, to trust in the fundamental decency of people who extended their hands in times of need. The rain continued its relentless drumming against the windows as Dave signed his name to documents he didn't fully understand, committing himself to a debt that would reshape his already precarious finances. But Carol's Honda would run again, and with it, the last tangible connection to the woman who'd taught him that independence didn't always mean standing alone. Outside, the storm showed no signs of abating, and Dave Patterson walked into it with the hollow satisfaction of a man who'd preserved something precious at a cost he couldn't yet calculate. Dave Patterson walked through the rain to the Uber that would carry him home, Tony's business card damp in his pocket, and the signed paperwork folded carefully in his wallet. The ride cost $18. Money he couldn't spare but had no choice but to spend. As Millbrook's modest downtown gave way to the apartment complex where he'd lived since selling the house he and Carol had shared, Dave stared through the rain-streaked window and tried to convince himself he'd made the right decision. His apartment occupied the second floor of a converted house that had seen better decades. The stairs creaked under his weight, each step a reminder of the shrapnel that had torn through his left leg during his final deployment. By the time he reached his door, his back had begun the familiar ache that announced rain with more accuracy than any weather forecast. Inside, the space felt smaller than usual. One bedroom, a kitchenette that Carol would have called cozy, and a living room dominated by the recliner where he spent most of his waking hours. Dave hung his damp jacket on the hook beside the door, noting how it dripped onto the linoleum in a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Everything felt temporary here, as if he were waiting for permission to settle into a life he hadn't chosen. Carol had picked their real home, with the careful attention she'd brought to every decision, weighing practicalities against dreams, always finding a balance that made sense. This apartment was different. This was survival. He opened his laptop. On the kitchen table, its screen casting blue light across bills and bank statements he'd organized with military precision. The spreadsheet Carol had created still tracked their finances, her formulas calculating payments and balances with the accuracy of someone who'd understood that numbers represented security, not just mathematics. Dave updated the checking account, in balance, then stared at the result. After the $2,000 down payment for the car repair, he'd have $837 in savings. His monthly disability check covered rent and utilities, with enough left over for groceries and basic necessities, but barely. The proposed payment plan would require an additional $350 each month for the next year. Money that would have to come from somewhere he couldn't identify. Dave leaned back in the kitchen chair, feeling the weight of 22 years of service settling into his shoulders like a pack he couldn't remove. The military had taught him to plan for contingencies, but this felt different from tactical preparation. This felt personal, like a test of character he was already failing. His phone buzzed against the table. Dave glanced at the screen, his brother Kevin calling from Kansas. They'd spoken perhaps a dozen times since Carol's funeral, conversations that danced around the obvious questions neither wanted to ask. Kevin had inherited their father's farm and the financial stability that came with generational ownership. He'd offered help before, always with the careful diplomacy of someone trying to preserve dignity while acknowledging need. Dave's thumb hovered over the answer button for 3 rings before moving to decline the call. Pride had been carved into him by a father who'd worked factory jobs to keep food on the table, reinforced by military training that demanded self-reliance above all else. Asking Kevin for money would feel like admitting he'd failed at the fundamental task of taking care of himself. The apartment fell silent again, except for the rain against the windows and the hum of the refrigerator cycling on. Dave closed the laptop and moved to the living room, settling into the recliner that had been Carol's last major purchase. She'd insisted on the expensive model with multiple adjustment settings, claiming his back deserved better than the second-hand furniture they'd accumulated over the years. "You've carried enough weight," she'd said, adjusting the lumbar support with the same attention she'd brought to everything that concerned his comfort. "Let something carry you for once." A soft knock at the door interrupted the memory. Dave checked the peephole to find Mrs. Chen from across the hall, her slight frame nearly lost under a large umbrella. He opened the door to find her holding a covered dish, her expression carrying the determined kindness he'd learned to recognize from other military wives. "I made too much soup," she said, though they both knew it wasn't true. "Tom's working late again, and I thought you might be hungry." Mrs. Chen's husband worked maintenance at the Air Force Base, and she'd appointed herself the unofficial caretaker of the building's residents with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing a household on military pay. Dave had noticed her watching him with the concerned attention Carol used to show toward neighbors who seemed to be struggling. "That's very kind," Dave said, accepting the dish. "But you don't need to—" "Nonsense," she interrupted. "We look after each other here. That's what neighbors do." After she left, Dave sat at the kitchen table with the soup cooling in front of him. The kindness felt heavier than gratitude could carry. Mrs. Chen's gesture represented the sort of community Carol had always encouraged him to embrace. But accepting help, even something as simple as a shared meal, felt like advertising his inability to provide for himself. The panic attack began as a flutter in his chest, familiar as an old injury. Dave recognized the signs from experience: the tightening breath, the sense that the walls were pressing closer, the conviction that something terrible was about to happen. He'd learned techniques in therapy, breathing exercises that Dr. Morrison insisted could help when the past invaded, the present without warning. But this wasn't about Afghanistan or the weight of decisions made under fire. This was about Carol's car and the $8,000 he didn't have, and the growing certainty that he was drowning in problems too large for his diminished life to contain. The panic felt different when it emerged from present circumstances, rather than traumatic memories, more immediate, less manageable. Dave gripped the table edge and forced himself to count breaths the way Dr. "Sorry, miss, but Tony Castellano's been running scams on people for years. Targets folks who don't know any better. Elderly, single women, veterans on fixed incomes. Makes me sick." "Have you reported him?" Lisa asked. Frank laughed bitterly. "To who? He's careful about staying just this side of legal, never puts anything provably false in writing, always phrases things as recommendations rather than requirements. And the local cops. They've got bigger problems than car repair disputes." Lisa felt pieces clicking into place, like components in a well-designed machine. "How long has this been going on?" 3, maybe 4 years. Started getting bad after his father passed, and Tony took over completely. The old man was honest, taught me some things when I was just starting out, but Tony—" Frank shook his head. "Tony's got problems. Gambling, from what I hear. Desperate people do desperate things." "What kind of problems?" Lisa pressed. Gently, Frank glanced around the shop, ensuring they were alone. "You didn't hear this from me, but word is he owes money to some serious people. The kind who don't accept late payments, been escalating his cons to keep up with the interest." Lisa filed the information away, her mind already organizing the intelligence for Rachel's team. "Have any of his victims ever tried to fight back?" "A few. But most of the people he targets can't afford lawyers, and by the time they realize they've been had, the work's already done, and he's got their signatures on everything." Frank's expression hardened. "You know what really gets me? A lot of his victims are veterans, men and women who served their country, and this piece of garbage preys on them when they're vulnerable." 20 minutes later, Lisa sat in her car, outside Frank's shop, composing a detailed message to Rachel while the conversation replayed in her mind. Frank had given her more than intelligence. He'd provided validation that their suspicions were correct, and that Dave Patterson was just the latest victim in a pattern of exploitation that had been operating for years. Meanwhile, Technical Sergeant Jake Williams was conducting his own investigation in a borrowed civilian truck, parked across the street from Castellano's auto repair. Through binoculars, he watched Tony move between vehicles in the service bay, his movements carrying the practiced efficiency of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. Jake had positioned himself to observe without being noticed, a skill learned during convoy security in Afghanistan, where observation often meant the difference between safe passage and ambush. What he saw confirmed his worst suspicions. Tony's repairs on various vehicles consisted mostly of theatrical movement, removing parts that didn't need replacement, documenting work that wasn't being performed, creating the appearance of intensive labor for customers who wouldn't know the difference. On one elderly customer's Buick, Jake watched Tony spend 20 minutes loosening and retightening the same bolt while occasionally stepping back to take photos of his progress. Jake's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Dave Patterson. Mac Johnson gave me your number. Tony Castellano called again about additional complications. Says he needs another $2,000 to finish the job. What should I tell him?" Jake typed back immediately. "Don't authorize anything. Stall him. Tell him you need to review finances. We'll explain more later." The response came quickly. "How much more can this cost me?" Jake stared at the phone screen, thinking about the broken timing chain that probably didn't exist, the inflated labor charges for work that wasn't being performed, and the desperate veteran being systematically robbed by a predator who'd made a career of exploiting trust. His brother Danny's face flashed through his memory. Another veteran who died not from enemy fire, but from the weight of problems that seemed too large to solve. "Nothing," Jake typed back. "It's going to cost you nothing. We've got this." Across town, Tony Castellano stood in the parts room of his father's shop, staring at invoices that told a story he'd been trying to ignore for months. The parts orders didn't match the repairs being claimed. Labor hours were inflated beyond any reasonable standard. Customer signatures appeared on work orders for services that weren't being performed. At 17, Tommy possessed the moral clarity that hadn't yet been compromised by adult rationalizations. He understood that what his father was doing was wrong, but he also understood that challenging it would destroy the only family he had left. His mother had died when he was 12, leaving him and Tony to navigate their relationship without her gentle mediation. Tommy's phone contained dozens of photos he'd taken over the past months, evidence of his father's fraudulent practices that he'd collected without fully understanding why. Part of him hoped he'd never need to use them. Another part of him knew that eventually choice would be taken out of his hands. In her office at the police station, Detective Maria Santos reviewed the formal complaint Frank Kowalski had filed that morning. It wasn't the first complaint against Castellano's auto repair, but it was the most detailed, and Frank's status as a respected business owner gave it weight that previous complaints had lacked. Maria had been building cases against predatory businesses for years, understanding that elderly residents and veterans represented particularly vulnerable populations in her community. The Castellano complaint fit a pattern she'd been tracking, but she needed more evidence before she could move beyond preliminary investigation. Her computer showed 3 other pending complaints against the shop, all following similar patterns. If she could find one more victim willing to go on record, she might have enough to warrant a deeper investigation. As evening settled over Millbrook, 4 separate investigations were converging on Tony Castellano's operation, each driven by different motivations, but united by a common understanding that some injustices demanded collective response. The wheels of justice were beginning to turn, slowly, but with the inexorable momentum that came from people who decided that enough was enough. Dave Patterson sat in his apartment, unaware that a small army of people he'd never met were working to solve problems he didn't yet know he had. His phone remained silent, but across town, phones buzzed with messages, plans were refined, and evidence was compiled by people who understood that protecting those who'd served was both a privilege and a responsibility. The storm was gathering, and Tony Castellano was about to discover that some targets fight back. Dave Patterson's phone rang at 7:23 a.m., jolting him from the uneasy sleep that had become his nightly routine since Carol's death. The caller ID showed Castellano's auto repair, and Dave's stomach immediately clenched with the familiar dread that accompanied unexpected morning calls. He'd learned to associate early phone calls with bad news, first from military service, then from doctors during Carol's illness, and now from mechanics who seemed to specialize in finding expensive problems. "Mr. Patterson, Tony here," came. The voice that had once seemed reassuring, but now carried undertones Dave couldn't identify. "I'm afraid we've run into some additional complications with your Honda. When we got deeper into the engine, we found more damage than initially apparent. The pistons show scoring, and the cylinder head's going to need machine work." Dave sat, up in bed, the morning light filtering through blinds that needed replacing, casting shadows across furniture that still felt temporary despite 2 years of occupancy. What does that mean in terms of cost? "Well, that's the thing," Tony continued, his voice carrying practiced reluctance. "We're looking at another $2,000 to handle the additional work. I know it's not what you wanted to hear, but these older engines sometimes hide problems until you really get into them." $2,000. The number hit Dave like incoming. Artillery, impossible to ignore and devastating in its implications. Combined with the original estimate, the total would now reach $10,000, more than Dave's annual savings, more than the car was worth, more than he could possibly manage without destroying what little financial stability he'd managed to maintain. "I need some time to think about this," Dave said, remembering Jake Williams' advice to stall. "That's a lot of money to come up with, on short notice." "I understand completely," Tony replied, his tone shifting to practiced sympathy. "But here's the thing, I've already started the machine work based on what we found. My guy at the machine shop doesn't work for free, and I'm looking at costs whether we finish the job or not." The manipulation was subtle but unmistakable. Tony was creating urgency, manufacturing consequences that would make backing out seem more expensive than moving forward. Dave recognized the tactic from his military experience with corrupt contractors, who'd tried similar approaches with supply requisitions. "How much time do I have to decide?" Dave asked. "Well, ideally I'd like to know by this afternoon. The machine shop wants payment up front, and I'm carrying the cost right now." After Tony hung up, Dave sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his phone and feeling the walls of his small apartment pressing closer. The panic attack began as a flutter in his chest, the familiar warning sign that his nervous system was preparing for fight or flight in a situation where neither option existed. His breathing became shallow, his vision narrowed, and the room seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. Dave tried the breathing exercises Dr. Morrison had taught him, but the techniques felt inadequate against the weight of financial catastrophe. This wasn't PTSD triggered by memories of combat. This was present-tense terror about problems that were growing beyond his ability to solve. The distinction mattered because it made the panic feel more real, more immediate, less manageable. Through therapy techniques designed for trauma processing, by 9 a.m., Dave knew he needed help. The admission felt like surrender, but survival required acknowledging when circumstances exceeded individual capacity. "Yesterday," Rachel replied. "Mac, what's Patterson's current status with the mechanic?" "Last I heard, Castellano was calling him about additional complications, probably setting up for even more charges." Rachel's expression darkened. Further, classic predator behavior: hook them with the initial estimate, then add charges when they're committed. She looked around her team, seeing the same determination reflected in each face. "All right, people, we've got a mission. Jake, I want that technical assessment by tomorrow morning. Lisa, complete background on Castellano and his business. Mac, you're our liaison with Patterson. Keep him informed, but tell him not to authorize any additional work." "Roger that, Master Sergeant," the 3 airmen replied in unison. As her team dispersed to their tasks, Rachel remained in the hangar, staring at the aircraft engines that surrounded her. She'd spent 18 years maintaining the machines that kept airmen alive in hostile environments. But this felt different. This was about maintaining the bonds that kept military families together long after the formal obligations ended. Her phone buzzed with a text from her teenage daughter asking about dinner plans. Rachel smiled, remembering all the times Dave Patterson had volunteered for extra duties so married airmen could get home to their families. He'd never asked for anything in return, never expected special treatment for his sacrifices. Now, it was time to return the favor. Rachel gathered her tools and headed toward the office where she kept her personal laptop. She had research to do and calls to make, but first, she needed to ensure that whatever action they took would be swift, decisive, and completely effective. Dave Patterson had served his country with honor. Now his country, in the form of 4 active duty airmen who understood the meaning of loyalty, was going to serve him. Captain Jennifer Brooks sat in her office at Edwards Air Force Base, surrounded by legal manuals and case files that formed the foundation of her work as the base's legal advisor. The morning sun streamed through Venetian blinds, casting parallel shadows across her desk, where she'd spread out printed copies of every regulation that might apply to what Master Sergeant Torres had described as helping a fellow veteran with car trouble. Jennifer had learned to read between the lines of such carefully neutral language. Her computer screen displayed search results for Castellano's auto repair, revealing a pattern that made her stomach tighten with each new entry. Better business. Bureau complaints stretching back 3 years, mostly from elderly customers and veterans. Each complaint told a similar story. Inflated estimates, unnecessary repairs, aggressive collection practices when customers questioned the charges. The business operated just within the boundaries of legality, careful never to cross lines that would trigger criminal investigation. Jennifer's phone buzzed with a message from Rachel Torres. Legal question: if airmen use personal time and resources to help veteran with car repair, any command issues? She typed back quickly, officially, personal time is personal time. Unofficially, keep detailed records of everything. Across town, Senior Airman Lisa Chen pushed through the glass door of Frank's Honest Auto Repair, her civilian clothes carefully chosen to suggest a young professional with car troubles rather than a military investigator. The shop occupied a converted gas station on Millbrook's older commercial strip, its hand-painted signs and weathered exterior suggesting the kind of establishment that survived on reputation rather than advertising. Frank Kowalski emerged from beneath the hood of a Subaru Outback, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. At 62, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body carried the accumulated weight of physical labor. But his eyes held the sharp awareness Lisa had learned to recognize in career military personnel. "Help you with something, miss?" Frank asked, his accent carrying traces of the Polish neighborhood where he'd grown up before Vietnam changed. "Everything." "I hope so," Lisa replied, affecting the slightly helpless tone that often encouraged helpful explanations. "I'm having some car trouble, and a friend recommended your shop, said you were honest and fair with your prices." Frank's expression warmed slightly. "Well, I tried to be. What kind of trouble you having?" Lisa described fictional symptoms that roughly matched what Mac had told her about Dave Patterson's Honda, watching Frank's reaction carefully. His diagnosis came quickly and precisely: water pump or thermostat, probably $200 in parts and labor. When she mentioned that another shop had quoted $8,000 for a complete engine rebuild, Frank's demeanor shifted entirely. "$8,000, he said, his voice carrying the controlled anger of someone who'd heard this story before. "Let me guess, Castellano's place." Lisa nodded, noting how Frank's jaw tightened at the mention of the name. "That son of a bitch," Frank muttered, then caught himself. "Rachel Torres?" Dave asked, memory stirring. "She was a corporal when I knew her." "Master Sergeant now and madder than hell about what's happening to you," Mac replied. "Sir, you're not alone in this anymore. We've got legal support, technical expertise, and a plan that's going to make Tony Castellano very sorry he picked the wrong veteran to mess with. As Dave signed his discharge papers, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Carol's death: the presence of allies who understood both the problem and the solution. The panic that had driven him to the hospital was being replaced by something else: the anticipation of justice, served by people who understood what loyalty meant. Outside the hospital, storm clouds were gathering again over Millbrook, but for the first time in months, Dave Patterson looked forward to what they might bring. The clock on Rachel Torres's desk read 11:47 p.m. when she gave the final briefing to her team, assembled in the parking lot behind Frank's Honest Auto Repair. Dave Patterson lay sedated in Millbrook General's observation ward, unaware that 4 active-duty Air Force personnel were about to launch the most unconventional maintenance operation of their careers. The hospital stay had provided the perfect cover, with Dave safely accounted for and Tony Castellano assuming his victim was too overwhelmed to cause trouble. The team had a narrow window to gather irrefutable evidence. "Remember," Rachel said quietly, her voice carrying the authority that had kept aircraft mission ready through 2 combat deployments. "We're ghosts. In and out. Document everything. Leave no trace." Jake and Mac handle the technical assessment. Lisa maintains overwatch and communications. I coordinate and ensure we don't cross any lines that can't be uncrossed. Jake Williams adjusted the small camera clipped to his shirt pocket, its lens barely visible in the dim light. "Master Sergeant, what if we find Dave's car in worse condition than Tony claimed? What if some of the damage is real?" "Then we fix it properly," Rachel replied. "But based on what we know about Tony's methods, I'm betting we'll find a perfectly good engine with maybe a $50 water pump problem." McJohnson picked the lock on Castellano's service bay, with skills learned during Air Force security training, his movements precise and economical in the darkness. The shop's interior smelled of motor oil and deception, tools arranged with the false orderliness of someone more concerned with appearances than authentic craftsmanship. Dave's Honda Civic sat in the corner bay, its hood propped open like a patient awaiting surgery that would never come. Lisa Chen positioned herself near the front windows, her phone connected to a security app that monitored the surrounding streets. Her logistical mind had mapped every escape route, identified every potential complication, and prepared contingencies for scenarios ranging from unexpected police patrols to Tony's unlikely middle-of-the-night appearance. "Perimeter clear," she whispered into her comm unit. "You've got at least an hour before any regular patrol activity." Jake approached Dave's Honda with the focused intensity he brought to aircraft engines, his trained eye immediately cataloging what Tony had actually done versus what he'd claimed. The timing chain cover had been removed and carelessly reinstalled, leaving scratches that suggested hasty work. But the timing chain itself appeared untouched, its tension exactly what Jake would expect from a component with 60,000 miles of normal operation. "Son of a bitch," Jake muttered, photographing the engine compartment from multiple angles. "The timing chain is perfect. Tony never even touched it." Mac leaned over Jake's shoulder, his own mechanical knowledge confirming what they'd suspected. "What about the pistons he claimed were scored?" Jake removed the oil filler cap and inserted a small inspection camera, the device displaying the engine's internals on his phone screen. "Pistons look fine. Cylinder walls are clean. This engine's got another 100,000 miles in it easy." His voice carried the controlled anger of a professional confronting fraudulent work that insulted everything he believed about honest craftsmanship. Rachel monitored their progress while photographing Tony's work orders and parts invoices, scattered across a nearby workbench. The documentation told a story of systematic deception. Parts ordered but never installed, labor hours claimed for work never performed, invoices for services that existed only on paper. Each piece of evidence felt like ammunition for the justice that Dave Patterson deserved. "Master Sergeant," Mac called softly, "you need to see this." He'd discovered a filing cabinet filled with similar work orders, dozens of repair estimates following identical patterns, elderly customers charged, thousands for transmission work that consisted of fluid changes, veterans billed for engine rebuilds that never happened, single mothers pressured into brake jobs that involved nothing more than cleaning and adjusting existing components. "How long has this been going on?" Rachel asked, photographing each damning document. "Based on these dates, at least 3 years, Mac replied. "And look at this. He keeps detailed records of customer financial information. Income levels, insurance coverage, family situations. He's profiling victims for maximum exploitation." Jake had moved to the actual repairs, his hands working with the quiet efficiency that marked master mechanics. The Honda's real problem proved to be exactly what Frank Kowalski had suspected: a failing water pump that would cost $73 to replace and require 2 hours of straightforward labor. Jake had the part in his tool bag, having anticipated the actual diagnosis based on the symptoms Dave had described. "Installing the new water pump now," he reported. "Should have this running properly within an hour." Lisa's voice came through their comm units with urgent clarity. "Vehicle approaching from the east, slowing down. Looks like. Wait, it's continuing past. False alarm." As Jake worked on the genuine repair, Rachel coordinated with Lisa to document Tony's broader operation. They photographed customer files, work orders, and the elaborate system Tony had developed for creating the appearance of complex repairs while performing minimal actual work. The evidence painted a picture of predatory business practices that went far beyond simple overcharging. At 1:23 a.m., an unexpected complication arose when Tony Castellano's car pulled into the shop's parking lot. Lisa immediately alerted the team, watching through night vision binoculars, as the teenager sat in his vehicle for several minutes before approaching the service bay entrance. "He's coming in," Lisa whispered. 17-year-old male, appears to be alone. Rachel made a split-second decision based on her assessment of Tommy's character from their surveillance reports. "Let him enter. Mac, intercept and explain. Jake, keep working." Tommy pushed through the service bay door and froze when he saw Mac emerging from the shadows, hands raised in a gesture of non-aggression. The teenager's face cycled through surprise, fear, and something that might have been relief. "Easy," Mac said quietly. "We're Air Force. We're here to help Staff Sergeant Patterson." "I know who you are," Tommy replied, his voice steadier than his age would suggest. "I've been waiting for someone to do something about what my father's been doing." The admission hung in the air between them like a confession waiting to be heard. Rachel stepped into the light, her rank and bearing immediately commanding Tommy's attention. "Son," she said, "we could use your help. But you need to understand, helping us means standing against your father." Tommy pulled out his phone, scrolling through dozens of photos that documented his father's fraudulent practices. "I've been collecting evidence for months. I knew someone would eventually figure out what he was doing, and I wanted to be ready to help when that happened." Jake completed the water pump installation at 2:17 a.m., the Honda purring with the smooth efficiency that Honda engineers had designed into the engine. The total cost of legitimate parts, $73. The time required for actual repair, 97 minutes. Tony's fraudulent estimate, $8,000 plus additional charges. As they prepared to leave, Tommy made a decision that would change everything. "There's something else you need to know," he said, handing Rachel a flash drive. "My father's been keeping electronic records of all his scams, customer profiles, financial assessments, communication strategies for pressuring victims. Everything's on here." Rachel accepted the drive with the solemnity of someone receiving evidence that would destroy lives and save others. "Son, you understand what this means for your family?" "My real family died when my mother passed," Tommy replied. "What my father's become, that's not family anymore." At 2:45 a.m., the team completed their mission and departed Castellano's auto repair, leaving behind a perfectly repaired Honda Civic and taking with them evidence that would unravel 3 years of systematic fraud. Dave Patterson's car was fixed, but more importantly, Tommy Castellano had chosen justice over misplaced loyalty, providing the final piece of evidence needed to ensure that Tony's predatory operation would never victimize another veteran. As they drove back to base through the pre-dawn darkness, Rachel felt the satisfaction that came from missions accomplished and wrongs made right. By morning, Dave Patterson would discover that his car problems had been solved by people who understood what military brotherhood actually meant. The reckoning was about to begin, and Tony Castellano had no idea that his carefully constructed web of deception was about to collapse around him. Dave Patterson returned from the hospital to find his Honda Civic sitting in his apartment complex's parking lot, like an answered prayer he hadn't dared to offer. The morning sun caught the car's blue paint, making it gleam with a vitality that seemed impossible after yesterday's mechanical death sentence. Taped to the windshield was an envelope bearing his name in careful handwriting, and Dave's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. "Staff Sergeant Patterson," the letter began, "your Honda has been properly repaired. The actual problem was a failed water pump. Total cost, $73 in parts. The timing chain never needed replacement. You've been the victim of systematic fraud. The people who fixed your car are your military family. We take care of our own. Drive safely. A friend." Dave stared at the letter, reading it 3 times before the words fully penetrated his consciousness. He turned the key with the reverence of someone testing a miracle, and the engine responded with the smooth purr that Honda engineers had designed into the machine. No rattles, no hesitation, no signs of the catastrophic failure Tony Castellano had described with such convincing detail. 23 miles across town, Tony Castellano discovered evidence of the break-in when he arrived at his shop at 7 a.m. The lock showed scratches that spoke of professional entry, and subtle signs throughout the service bay suggested his space had been thoroughly searched. But nothing appeared missing, and the security cameras he'd installed to monitor employee theft showed only empty frames where the recording drives should have been. Tony's initial confusion transformed into cold dread when he found Dave Patterson's Honda missing from its assigned bay. The car had been his insurance policy, physical evidence of the extensive repairs that justified his inflated charges. Without it, he'd have difficulty explaining the work orders and parts invoices to anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. His phone rang with Detective Maria Santos's number displayed on the screen. Tony's mouth went dry as he answered, his voice carrying forced casualness. "Castellano's Auto Repair, Tony speaking." "Mr. Castellano, this is Detective Santos with Millbrook Police. I need to speak with you about some complaints we've received regarding your business practices. Would you be available for an interview this morning?" The words hit Tony like incoming artillery, confirming his worst fears about the break-in and the missing Honda. Someone had been building a case against him, and the net was closing with the inevitability he'd always known would eventually come. "What kind of complaints?" Tony asked, already knowing the answer. "Allegations of fraudulent repair estimates and unnecessary work charges. I'd prefer to discuss the details in person. Can you meet me at the station, or would you prefer I come to your shop?" Tony's gambling-addicted mind ran through the odds, calculating risks and potential escape routes with the desperate efficiency that had kept him one step ahead of creditors for 3 years. Coming to the station meant walking. into controlled environment where Detective Santos would have every advantage. But having her come to the shop meant exposing himself to whatever evidence the break-in team had left behind. "I can come to the station," he said, choosing the option that felt less immediately threatening. 30 minutes later, Tony sat across from Detective Santos in an interview room that smelled of institutional coffee and broken promises. The detective spread photographs across the table between them, images of work orders, parts invoices, and repair estimates that told a story Tony couldn't deny because he'd authored every fraudulent page. "Mr. Castellano," Detective Santos began, her voice carrying the patient authority of someone who'd built countless cases through meticulous evidence gathering. "These documents show a pattern of charging customers for repairs that weren't performed. Can you explain these discrepancies?" Tony stared at the photographs, recognizing his own handwriting and business practices reflected back at him like evidence from a crime scene. The timing chain replacement he'd charged Dave Patterson $8,000 for was documented. In painful detail, parts never ordered, labor never performed, diagnosis that had no basis in mechanical reality. "I don't know where you got these," Tony said, his voice lacking conviction even to his own ears. "From your own files," Detective Santos replied, "along with customer financial profiles that suggest you deliberately target vulnerable populations, veterans, elderly residents, single mothers. That's not coincidental, Mr. Castellano. That's predatory behavior." While Tony faced his reckoning at the police station, Mac Johnson was making his own revelation to Dave Patterson in the parking lot outside his apartment complex. Dave sat behind the wheel of his perfectly functioning Honda, listening to Mac explain the night's operation with growing amazement and gratitude. "You broke into his shop?" Dave asked, his military mind appreciating the tactical precision while his civilian conscience grappled with the legal implications. "We gathered evidence of fraud and performed legitimate repairs," Mac replied carefully. "Everything we did was to help a fellow veteran who was being systematically robbed." Dave's phone buzzed with an incoming call from Sarah Martinez at Channel E7 News. Mac had anticipated this development. The story was too compelling to remain contained within military circles, and Sarah's background as a military spouse gave her both access to sources and understanding of the cultural dynamics at play. "Staff Sergeant Patterson?" Sarah's voice carried the professional sympathy that marked experienced journalists. "I'm investigating reports of fraudulent auto repair practices targeting veterans. I understand you may have been a victim of such practices." Dave looked at Mac, who nodded encouragement. The story was going public whether Dave participated or not, but his testimony could ensure other victims came forward and that the broader pattern of exploitation received proper attention. "Yes," Dave said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was acknowledging. "I believe I was deliberately defrauded by Tony Castellano." Within hours, Sarah's initial news report had gone viral on social media. Mac's strategic use of veteran networking groups, amplifying the story across military communities throughout the region. The phones at Channel 7 rang constantly with calls from other Castellano victims, retired Air Force personnel who'd been charged thousands for transmission repairs that consisted of fluid changes, elderly veterans pressured into brake jobs that involved nothing more than cleaning and adjustment. Tony Castellano watched his father's world collapse from his high school computer lab, monitoring news reports and social media posts that chronicled the systematic fraud operation he'd helped expose. His phone contained dozens of missed calls from Tony, each voicemail more desperate than the last, but Tommy had made his choice during the midnight hours when he'd handed evidence to the Air Force team. At 3 p.m., Detective Santos arrested Tony Castellano on charges of consumer fraud, elder abuse, and operating a criminal enterprise. The charges would ultimately expand as more victims came forward, but the foundation was solid. Documentation provided by his own son, expert testimony from Frank Kowalski and Jake Williams, and a paper trail that revealed 3 years of systematic exploitation. Dave Patterson drove his perfectly functioning Honda to Edwards Air Force Base that afternoon, where Master Sergeant Rachel Torres waited with the rest of her team in the parking lot outside the main gate. When he stepped out of the car, Rachel's face carried the satisfaction of someone who'd seen justice properly served. "Staff Sergeant Patterson," she said, extending her hand with the respect due to a fellow veteran. "Welcome back to the family." Dave accepted the handshake, feeling connections he'd thought were permanently severed being restored by people who understood that military brotherhood transcended discharge papers and retirement ceremonies. For the first time since Carol's death, he wasn't alone. As the sun set over Millbrook, Tony Castellano sat in a jail cell, calculating the cost of 3 years' worth of predatory behavior, while Dave Patterson drove home in a car that represented more than transportation. It was proof that some debts were paid by people who understood honor, loyalty, and the true meaning of taking care of those who'd served. The truth was finally out, and justice was just beginning. Sarah Martinez's investigative report aired at 6 p.m., transforming what had begun as one veteran's car trouble into a community-wide reckoning with predatory business practices. The story opened with Dave Patterson standing beside his Honda Civic, his military bearing intact despite months of financial stress, describing how Tony Castellano had exploited his trust and vulnerability. "I served my country for 22 years, Dave said, looking directly into the camera. "I never expected to come home and get robbed by someone who was supposed to help me." The report detailed the midnight mission with careful attention to legal boundaries, presenting the Air Force team's actions as concerned citizens who'd used their technical expertise to help a fellow veteran. Master Sergeant Rachel Torres appeared in uniform, her words carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to speak for military values. "We don't abandon our people," Rachel stated simply. "Staff Sergeant Patterson served with honor, and when we learned he was being exploited, we acted. That's what military families do." Within hours, the story had spread across social media platforms and veteran networks throughout the region. Dave's phone rang constantly with calls from other Castellano victims, a retired Navy chief who'd been charged $4,000 for a transmission. Flush, an elderly Air Force widow pressured into $6,000 worth of unnecessary brake work. A disabled Marine who'd paid $3,500 for engine repairs that were never performed. At Edwards Air Force Base, Captain Jennifer Brooks monitored the legal implications as the story gained national attention. Military news outlets picked up the narrative, framing it as an example of active duty personnel supporting veterans in their civilian struggles. The Air Force Public Affairs Office worked to manage messaging, while the base commander privately commended the team's actions, despite their unauthorized nature. Tommy Castellano watched from his high school's media center as his father's mugshot appeared on television screens across Millbrook. Students whispered when they recognized the family name, but Tommy felt only relief that the deception had finally ended. His phone contained 17 missed calls from Tony, each voicemail more desperate as the scope of the criminal charges became clear. Detective Maria Santos coordinated with the district attorney's office as additional charges were filed based on new victim testimonies. What had begun as consumer fraud was expanding into elder abuse, criminal conspiracy, and organized financial exploitation. The evidence Tommy had provided detailed records of customer profiling and systematic targeting of vulnerable populations, transformed the case from isolated incidents into proof of sustained criminal enterprise. Frank Kowalski found himself Interviewed by multiple news outlets, his status as an honest mechanic providing credible contrast to Tony's predatory practices. "This isn't about business competition," Frank explained to reporters. "This is about protecting people who trusted someone to help them and got robbed instead." As the week progressed, the Castellano story became a catalyst for broader discussions about veteran vulnerability and community responsibility. Local churches organized car repair funds for elderly and disabled residents. The Better Business Bureau announced enhanced oversight of automotive repair complaints. City council members proposed legislation requiring detailed estimates and customer cooling-off periods for major automotive repairs. Dave Patterson discovered that accepting help had led not to dependence, but to purpose. Victims who'd suffered in isolation for years now had someone who understood their experience and could guide them through the process of seeking justice and restitution. The truth was out, and it was changing everything. 3 months after Tony Castellano's arrest, the Millbrook County Courthouse filled with an unusual assembly of witnesses for his sentencing hearing. Veterans from multiple service branches occupied the gallery, alongside elderly residents, single mothers, and community members who'd come to witness justice served for crimes that had touched nearly every family in town. Dave Patterson sat in the front row, his military bearing intact but softened by the confidence that came from no longer facing his battles alone. Judge Patricia Williams reviewed the case file with the methodical attention that had marked her 20-year career on the bench. The evidence against Tony was overwhelming. 37 documented victims, financial records showing systematic exploitation patterns, and expert testimony that painted a picture of calculated predation spanning 3 years. The defendant's gambling addiction, while explaining his motivations, couldn't excuse the deliberate targeting of vulnerable populations. "Mr. Castellano," Judge Williams said, her voice carrying the weight of institutional justice, "you exploited the trust of people who'd served their country and community members who depended on your expertise. This court sentences you to 4 years in state prison, followed by 5 years probation and restitution totaling $347,000 to your victims." Tony's shoulders sagged as the sentence was pronounced. The mathematical precision of his crimes finally translated into concrete consequences. Behind him, Tony Castellano watched his father's world collapse with emotions too complex for 17-year-old understanding. Grief for the family that had disintegrated, relief that the deception had ended, and hope that justice might create space for different kinds of relationships. Outside the courthouse, Dave Patterson found himself surrounded by local news crews and fellow victims who'd drawn strength from his willingness to speak publicly about exploitation and recovery. His transformation from isolated veteran to community advocate had been gradual but unmistakable, built on the foundation of connections restored through unexpected circumstances. "The real story isn't about car repairs," Dave told Sarah Martinez during a follow-up interview. "It's about what happens when people decide to take care of each other. I thought I was alone, but I was wrong. None of us are alone if we're willing to accept help and offer it to others." At Edwards Air Force Base, the morning formation included a ceremony that balanced military protocol with acknowledgement of actions that had technically violated regulations while serving higher principles. Master Sergeant Rachel Torres and her team stood at attention as Colonel Harrison addressed their unauthorized but effective intervention in civilian affairs. "Military personnel are expected to follow proper channels," the colonel stated, his voice carrying formal authority. "However, the Air Force values initiative, technical excellence, and commitment to helping those who've served." Staff Sergeant Johnson Technical Sergeant Williams, Senior Airman Chen, and Master Sergeant Torres, you're hereby commended for community service while receiving official reprimands for unauthorized activities. The contradiction reflected the military's struggle to balance institutional discipline with individual moral imperatives. The commendations would enhance their service records. The reprimands would remind future personnel that good intentions didn't automatically justify independent action. But privately, the colonel felt nothing but pride in airmen who'd remembered that service extended beyond duty hours and official responsibilities. Frank Kowalski's shop had become an unexpected training ground for automotive integrity. Tony Castellano arrived every afternoon after school, learning honest repair techniques from a man who'd spent 40 years building reputation through competence and fairness. The mentorship represented redemption for a teenager who'd watched his father's corruption destroy everything they'd built together. "Your father had good hands," Frank told Tommy as they worked on a customer's transmission. "He learned proper techniques before the gambling took over. The knowledge is still there in how he taught you to hold tools, read diagnostic equipment. We just need to add character to the competence." Tommy absorbed these lessons with the intensity of someone rebuilding identity from fundamentally altered circumstances. His father's crimes had destroyed one kind of family, but Frank's patience was creating different possibilities, relationships based on shared values rather than blood, mentorship that prioritized integrity over convenience. Detective Maria Santos reviewed case files that showed the broader impact of the Castellano investigation. 12 other businesses had come under scrutiny following victim reports of similar practices. The automotive fraud unit she'd proposed had received funding approval, and legislation requiring detailed estimates and cooling-off periods for major repairs was moving through the state legislature. "Sometimes one case breaks everything open," she explained to a group of law enforcement professionals studying predatory business practices. The Castellano prosecution gave victims permission to come forward about exploitation they'd been suffering. In silence, that's how you build communities that protect vulnerable populations. At the Millbrook Community Center, Dave Patterson addressed a gathering of veterans, elderly residents, and family members who'd come to hear about the support network that had emerged from his experience with automotive fraud. The organization they'd created, Military and Community Mutual Aid, had already helped 17 families navigate financial crises, medical emergencies, and housing instability. "None of us succeeded by ourselves," Dave told the assembled crowd. "Military service teaches you to rely on your unit, but somehow we forget that lesson when we transition to civilian life. This organization exists to remind us that the unit doesn't disappear when you hang up the uniform." Lisa Chen had taken primary responsibility for coordinating the aid network. Her logistical expertise, creating systems that connected people who needed help with those who had resources to offer. Mac Johnson managed the organization's social media presence, using digital platforms to build connections that transcended geographic boundaries. Jake Williams supervised a volunteer network of mechanics who provided honest automotive assessments for elderly and disabled community members. As autumn settled over Millbrook, Dave Patterson visited Carol's grave, carrying flowers and news she would have appreciated. The simple headstone bore her name and the dates that had defined their shared life, but Dave's presence there felt different now, less like mourning and more like reporting to someone who'd always believed in his capacity for connection and growth. "You were right about accepting help," he said quietly, arranging the flowers with military precision. "Turned out I wasn't as alone as I thought. And the car you gave me, it ended up connecting me to family I didn't know I still had." The wind carried his words across the cemetery where other veterans rested beneath markers that recorded service and sacrifice. Dave understood now that their legacy lived not in individual achievement, but in the relationships they'd built and the communities they'd strengthened through shared values and mutual support. He drove home in the Honda that had started everything, its engine purring with the reliability Carol had chosen and the integrity that honest mechanics had restored. The car represented more than transportation now. It was proof that some problems could be solved by people who understood that taking care of each other wasn't just military doctrine, but the foundation of communities that honored service and protected those who'd given everything for principles larger than themselves. The sun set over Millbrook as Dave Patterson returned to an apartment that no longer felt temporary, carrying keys to a car that connected him to a family that extended far beyond biology or deployment rosters. Justice had been served, relationships had been restored, and the work of building communities that protected vulnerable people would continue long after the headlines faded and the news crews moved on to other stories. Some endings were really beginnings, and some families were chosen rather than inherited. Dave Patterson had learned both lessons through circumstances he'd never wanted to face, supported by people he'd never expected to meet, in a town that had become home in ways he was still discovering. The Honda started on the first turn of the key, and Dave smiled as he remembered Carol's voice promising that reliable things would get him where he needed to go. She'd been right about that too. Up next, you've got two more standout stories, right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.